Imagine being the most hated man in your city. You have wealth, power, fine clothes, and an imposing house, but you live in constant isolation and rejection. Every day you're reminded by contemptuous glances and whispered insults, calling you a traitor. This was Zacchaeus' life. He was the chief tax collector in Jericho, a man whose very name evoked betrayal and corruption. To everyone, Zacchaeus was spiritually dead, beyond any hope of redemption. But something extraordinary happened on an otherwise ordinary day when Jesus was passing through Jericho. Something that defied all expectations and forever changed the story of this rejected man. In the middle of the crowd, Jesus stopped right under the fig tree where Zacchaeus had climbed, just to catch a glimpse of him preaching. And then, in a moment no one could have predicted, Jesus looked directly at him and gave a surprising command. "Zacchaeus, come down quickly, for today I must stay at your house." But why him? Out of an entire crowd? What did Jesus see in Zacchaeus that no one else could see? And what could this unexpected encounter reveal about the heart of God? Stay with us until the end to uncover the truth behind this secret encounter that still challenges our understanding of justice, grace, and mercy. Zacchaeus, a name that in Jericho stirred emotions difficult to describe. For some, it was synonymous with betrayal. For others, corruption. But for almost everyone, he was nothing more than a despicable figure, a clear example of someone who had sold his soul for Roman coins. The city knew him well. Jericho was an important commercial hub with bustling streets, merchants from all over, and visitors from distant regions. Through its alleys passed goods, animals, perfumes, food, and to the constant burden of taxes. And who was at the center of this machinery? Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector. Being a tax collector was already enough to be despised. After all, they were Jews working for the Roman Empire. They were responsible for collecting abusive taxes from their own brothers in faith and blood. But being the chief tax collector, that was a whole different story. That made Zacchaeus the ultimate symbol of exploitation, a first-class traitor, a man who in the eyes of the people had already signed his own spiritual death sentence. Wherever he went, eyes followed him with contempt. Mothers pulled their children away. Elders whispered curses under their breath. Young men watched him with restrained anger. Zacchaeus was avoided in the synagogues, ignored in the squares, isolated during celebrations. There was no place for him at feasts, family gatherings, or moments of worship. His presence was a constant reminder of everything that was wrong in Israel. Roman domination, social injustice, moral corruption. Ironically, he was a man of wealth. His clothes were among the finest, his sandals made from imported leather, his house one of the largest in Jericho. While many struggled to put bread on the table, Zacchaeus accumulated gold coins, and for many that only fueled their hatred. Towards him the image was clear, a man who grew rich at the expense of others' suffering. Inside, however, the reality was quite different. The walls of his house might have been covered with expensive tapestries, but his heart was empty. The nights were long, meals were silent, the rooms cold. There were no true friends, only flatterers, false allies, and other men just as rejected as he was. Zacchaeus tried to fill this void with whatever he could. He bought more, invested more, renovated his house, acquired new goods. But no matter how much his possessions grew, the hole inside him only deepened. There were nights when he wondered if it was all worth it, if all that gold could really buy him any form of respect. And deep down, he knew the answer. It couldn't. Memories from his childhood haunted him too. Once he had been just an ordinary Jewish boy running through the streets of Jericho, dreaming of an honorable future. Perhaps he had dreamed of becoming a rabbi or a respected leader in the community, but the paths he chose or that life imposed on him led him elsewhere to a path of isolation and rejection. Sometimes as he walked through the streets, he tried to keep his eyes fixed on the horizon, ignoring the turned faces, the whispers, the pointed fingers. But there were days when the weight on his soul was too much. He saw couples walking hand in hand, children playing on street corners, families gathering to celebrate important dates, and he felt a sharp pain inside, a longing for something he may have never even had. Religion was also denied to him, not only by people but by himself. He knew the spiritual leaders of Jericho considered him impure. He knew that even if he tried, his presence would be unwanted in the synagogue. It was as if his soul carried an invisible stamp beyond redemption. And so Zacchaeus kept on living between luxury and emptiness, power and rejection, outward comfort and inner misery, a walking contradiction, a man who seemed to have everything but in reality had nothing that truly mattered. But there was something no one knew. Not even he fully understood it. A hidden desire, a restlessness that grew day by day, a silent voice calling him to something different, something he couldn't name, but also couldn't ignore. On sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling of his silent house, he wondered, is there any chance for someone like me? Will anyone ever look at me differently? Will I always be the rejected one? And this doubt, this inner echo began to grow irresistibly, but not even all that rejection could silence a hidden longing in his heart. The silent longing in Zacchaeus' heart kept growing, but around him, the system remained relentless. Jericho, despite its natural beauty and commercial importance, was just another piece on the giant chessboard of the Roman Empire. Rome ruled with an iron fist, and every city, every village, every family felt the weight of this oppression. The streets of Jericho told stories of tears and sweat. The sound of coins falling into collection bags was familiar. But behind every coin collected was the face of a desperate father, a widow barely scraping by, farmers who worked day and night only to have their livelihood taken away through taxes and levies. Rome was cunning. Instead of sending its own officials to collect taxes in distant provinces, it preferred to use local agents, Jews willing to trade their own honor for profit, men who knew the people, their customs, their hiding places, and the tricks their compatriots would use to try to escape the collections. And that's how the figure of the tax collector was born. They were the tax gatherers. They worked with quotas. They purchased from the Roman government the right to exploit a specific region, and once the contract was in their hands, they had almost total freedom to collect as much as they wanted, as long as they sent Rome its due share. Zacchaeus was not just a tax collector. He was their chief, the one responsible for the entire collection network in Jericho. He supervised the other collectors, organized strategies to increase revenue, and set the targets the others had to meet. He wasn't just part of the system. He was one of the pillars sustaining it in that region. And that came with a price, a human cost, a spiritual cost. Zacchaeus saw the fearful looks when his employees knocked on doors. He knew about the tears shed after their visits. He was aware of the curses whispered against his name in back alleys and narrow streets. Sometimes he heard reports of families losing their land because they couldn't pay the taxes. Other times he heard of children going hungry, and yet the system demanded results. Rome accepted no excuses. There was also the scorn from religious leaders. For the Pharisees and scribes, tax collectors were public sinners, impure. There was no place for them in the synagogues. No sacrifice could ever make them clean. They were seen as traitors not just politically but spiritually, people who had turned their backs on God. Zacchaeus knew this reality well. He knew the price of his choices. He knew what he had lost in exchange for what he had gained. But in the beginning, he had convinced himself that it was all worth it. After all, who didn't want financial security? Who didn't crave stability in such an uncertain world? Who didn't seek respect through power? For a long time, these were the justifications he repeated to himself like a mantra. However, as the years passed, the weight of conscience grew. With every new coin counted, a new doubt arose. With every new possession acquired, a new restlessness haunted him. What once seemed like success now started to taste bitter. It was like drinking salt water. The more he tried to quench his thirst for satisfaction, the thirstier he became. The system he was part of was a machine that crushed lives, destroyed dreams, and fed only those at the top. And he, as high as he stood, felt his soul falling deeper every day. Zacchaeus knew that in society's eyes he had won, but inside he felt like the greatest of losers. The wealth he had accumulated, the properties he had bought, the luxurious clothes, none of it filled the growing hole inside him like an open wound. The cries of injustice from the people of Jericho echoed in his mind as if they were tattooed on his conscience. And paradoxically, the richer he became, the more he realized the poverty of his own spirit. The system had placed him in a position of power, but it had deprived him of something far more valuable: peace of mind, dignity before his people, and above all the hope of redemption. He looked at the other tax collectors with contempt. He knew they were as corrupt as he was, maybe even worse. But in moments of silence in the middle of the night, he knew that his own corruption was the one that condemned him the most. While counting coins on the table in his living room, while signing documents that decreed the misery of entire families, Zacchaeus sometimes let his gaze wander beyond the curtains of his house, as if searching out there for some kind of answer. There were nights when he walked alone through the halls of his house and asked himself, "How did I get here? When did I lose what really mattered?" Each day his soul sank a little more, and the higher he climbed financially, the deeper he fell spiritually. The gold coins gleamed under the lamplight that night. The stone walls of Zacchaeus' house reflected the golden glow, as if they were silent witnesses to his financial ascent. Persian rugs covered the cold floor. Linen curtains shielded the rooms from the desert dust, and the shelves displayed imported silver jars and goblets. To any visitor, Zacchaeus' house was a symbol of success, but to the homeowner, that place was an empty palace. Zacchaeus walked from room to room, running his fingers over valuable objects, trying in vain to find satisfaction in the cold texture of metals and precious stones. His table was always full with delicacies brought from distant lands, aged wines, exotic fruits, expensive spices. Everything money could buy he had. But the essential was missing. Every night as he lay on fine linen sheets, insomnia was his faithful companion. Physical comfort couldn't calm the turmoil of his soul. The questions haunted him, invading his thoughts, even in moments of deepest exhaustion. Why do I still feel like this? Why does this emptiness grow even when everything around me shines with prosperity? During the day, Zacchaeus tried to distract himself with business contracts and revenue strategies. He ordered his subordinates to be stricter in collections. He expanded his possessions, closed commercial deals. But as soon as the silence of night fell over Jericho, the echo of his conscience returned with renewed strength. He remembered how it all began. At first, ambition seemed like a tool to overcome life's hardships. A young Jewish man rejected by the religious leaders with few opportunities in society, who found in tax collection a way to prosper. In the beginning, his moral values still tried to speak. But over time, the sound of coins drowned out the voice of ethics. First came small concessions, then harsher decisions, until without realizing it, he was completely immersed in a system that fed his wealth at the expense of others' misery. No matter how much he tried to justify himself, people's eyes always reminded him, "You are a traitor." And worse still, he began to believe it. There were nights when Zacchaeus looked out the window of his house, watching the humble families of Jericho gathered around small fires. They had no luxury, no gold, but they seemed to have what he lacked: belonging, community, faith. How many times had Zacchaeus envied those simple moments? How many times had he wished to sit with someone and have an honest conversation without hidden agendas, without fear of judgment? But he knew no one would open their door to him. No one would invite him in. His wealth had built high walls around him, and now he was a prisoner of what he had built. The cold nights felt even sharper inside his loneliness. The candles burned down to the end, lighting only the emptiness. And while gold piled up in chests and wooden boxes, the weight of sorrow accumulated in his heart. Looking at his collection of valuable objects, Zacchaeus sometimes wondered, how many of these coins would it take to buy a little peace? What would I give for one peaceful night's sleep without guilt haunting me? The household servants, though obedient, were distant. Their words were mechanical, their expressions empty. There was respect, yes, but no affection. And Zacchaeus felt every drop of that coldness. The life he had built had become a golden prison. Over time, he began going out less. He avoided crossing paths with neighbors, avoided the squares, avoided the markets. He knew that wherever he went, there would always be a reproachful look, a cruel whisper, a child pulled away by a mother to avoid his presence. And it was in this state of anguish that some rumors began to reach him. Muted voices around the city spoke of a different kind of man, someone called Jesus of Nazareth, a teacher walking through villages and towns preaching about love, mercy, and redemption. Zacchaeus overheard fragments of conversations among his servants. Some said Jesus had healed the blind. Others claimed he had made the paralyzed walk. There were even those who swore they had witnessed the deliverance of the demon-possessed. But what caught Zacchaeus' attention most was the fact that this man, this Jesus, did not shy away from the marginalized. On the contrary, he walked among them. He touched them, spoke with them, sat at the table with sinners, with tax collectors. One night, as he rested his tired eyes against the back of a chair, Zacchaeus overheard two of his servants whispering that Jesus was on his way to Jericho. And at that very moment, something stirred inside him. It was as if a forgotten flame, almost extinguished by the winds of time, began to rekindle. The name Jesus kept echoing in Zacchaeus' mind, like a silent invitation, like a distant promise, a remote possibility of something he still couldn't define. The emptiness was still there. The sadness, the guilt, the loneliness all remained. But now something new mixed with those feelings. Hope, until finally he started to hear more rumors about a man called Jesus. Before we continue, we kindly ask for your support. Subscribe to our channel and leave a like to help us bring stories like Zacchaeus, stories of hope and restoration to more hearts longing for a second chance. Now let's continue this journey of rediscovering grace. The rumors continued to spread through Jericho with surprising speed. Every street corner, every market, every small gathering seemed to have only one topic. Jesus was on his way. For some, it was an opportunity to witness a miracle. For others, the curiosity of seeing up close the one who challenged the Pharisees and spoke with authority about the scriptures. Many simply wanted to see the face of the man who, according to reports, was restoring hope to broken people. And for Zacchaeus, it stirred something inside him that he himself couldn't name. At first, when he heard the name Jesus, he thought it was just another wandering preacher, like so many others who appeared from time to time promising change and spreading empty speeches. But as the days went by, as the stories became more frequent and the reports more astonishing, Zacchaeus began to feel a kind of restlessness he hadn't known for a long time. It was a mixture of curiosity and longing, an anxiety that settled deep in his chest, growing with every new account. That morning when he woke up, the air felt different. The streets of Jericho were busier than usual. Merchants hurriedly prepared their stalls. Children ran back and forth, and the elders positioned themselves at the corners with watchful eyes as if awaiting a royal parade. Zacchaeus watched it all from the window of his house. The unusual movement tightened his stomach. He wondered with a strange sense of hope if perhaps this Jesus would pass right in front of his street. He imagined what he might look like, what his voice would sound like, how his gaze would feel. He knew something inside was stirring him, an inner calling. It was as if his heart beat to a different rhythm, faster, restless. During breakfast he couldn't eat. The aroma of dates, freshly baked bread, and wine seemed tasteless. The servants noticed his distant gaze, but, as usual, avoided any comment. The master of the house did not like unnecessary conversations, but Zacchaeus could barely contain himself. Suddenly, with no logical explanation, he felt compelled to leave. He walked through the house, grabbed his simplest cloak — he didn't want to draw attention at that moment — and stepped out onto the streets. As soon as his feet touched the stone sidewalk, he was met by the commotion. People of all ages and social classes hurried to find a good spot along the road where Jesus would pass. Some carried children on their shoulders, others held palm branches. There were the sick, the elderly, mothers with babies in their arms, all with a spark of expectation in their eyes. Zacchaeus' heart began to beat even faster. He walked with short steps, trying to blend into the crowd. But it wasn't easy. His figure was too well known in Jericho. Even in more discreet clothing, people recognized him. Whispers began to arise around him. Look, the traitor, the chief tax collector, what's he doing here? Is he here to collect taxes even from Jesus? The comments cut like invisible knives. But for the first time in a long while, Zacchaeus didn't care. There was a greater desire moving him now. Something that surpassed shame, fear, and pride. He needed to see Jesus. He needed at least once to look into the eyes of the man everyone said was different. Maybe, just maybe, he would see Zacchaeus differently. Maybe. But there was a problem that became more and more obvious. The crowd. The more people gathered along the roadside, the less space there was. Zacchaeus, being short in stature, could barely see beyond the backs and heads of those in front of him. He tried squeezing between shoulders, but was pushed back. Tried to look over someone, but his height made it impossible. And even if there had been space, who would make way for him? No one. No one in Jericho was willing to clear a path for the most hated man in town. At that moment, the physical barrier became a symbol of the emotional and spiritual barrier he had always faced. That crowd became a reflection of Zacchaeus' life. Always on the outside, always prevented from seeing, always pushed away, always rejected. Sweat dripped from his forehead. His heart pounded faster, not just from walking or the heat of the day, but from the anguish of realizing he might be so close and yet still so far. The enthusiastic shouts of the crowd announced that Jesus was already approaching. The tension rose. People pushed, trying to get better positions. Some climbed onto rocks. Others leaned on low walls. Zacchaeus amid all those, and people was just another frustrated face overshadowed by the human wall separating him from Jesus. But he knew he couldn't give up. Not now. As he looked around, his gaze searching for a solution, his heart seemed to scream inside his chest. That strange, almost suffocated desire was now an urgent need. He had to find a way. He couldn't let that moment slip away. What had once been a mere discomfort had now become an irresistible force. Zacchaeus felt that if he missed this opportunity, he might never get another. But one thing stood in his way. The crowd. The sound of the crowd was deafening. Shouts of excitement, cries of hope, and even improvised songs echoed through the narrow streets of Jericho. Everyone wanted a glimpse of Jesus. Everyone sought a miracle, a look, maybe a word of blessing. Men, women, young people, and the elderly crowded together like never before seen in the city. Zacchaeus, however, was an island of frustration in the middle of that sea of expectations. No matter how hard he tried, his eyes could only reach the broad backs of the men in front of him, or the colorful scarves covering the women's heads. Some children, more agile, climbed small walls to get a better view. Young men stood on stones. Even the elderly with difficulty leaned on their canes trying to catch a glimpse. But no one, absolutely no one, thought of making room for him. Every attempt to move forward was frustrated by subtle shvees or disapproving glances. Zacchaeus knew this treatment well. It was the same he received every day in the markets, in the squares, at public events. The fact that he was there trying to get close to Jesus was already an audacity to many. "What's he doing here?" whispered an elderly woman, clutching her coin purse to her chest as if Zacchaeus might rob her right there. "Did he come to collect tithes from Jesus too?" Another man mocked, laughing loud enough for Zacchaeus to hear. The sarcastic smiles and sharp looks were like invisible arrows, but painful ones. Every step he took felt like a reminder that he wasn't welcome, that his presence was unwanted, that even in the middle of a crowd he was still utterly alone. And what bothered him the most was realizing that behind all that apparent faith, the people around him still carried the same old hatred for him. Zacchaeus tried standing on tiptoes, but it was useless. His small body was a physical obstacle, but he knew it was just a reflection of his spiritual condition. He was small, not only in stature, but in social consideration, in dignity, in the eyes of others, and in his own self-esteem. For a moment he thought about giving up, turning back, going home, and ending right there. That irrational desire to see Jesus. "What's the point?" he whispered to himself. "I know he won't look at me. He's a holy man, and I am who I am." But the very next second, as if an invisible force pushed him, Zacchaeus took a deep breath. There was something greater moving him that day, a restlessness stronger than shame, a hope that suffocated fear. He looked around, searching for alternatives. The crowd, denser by the minute, blocked any passage. People stacked themselves on sidewalks, leaned against the walls of houses, occupied the steps of doorways. There was no path, no gap, not a single soul willing to make way for the most hated man in Jericho. His gaze then scanned the sides of the street as if seeking an escape. That's when he saw it a few meters ahead, a sycamore fig tree. Its sturdy branches stretched in various directions. It was an old tree, but a strong one, with a thick trunk and wide leaves. ZACCHAEUS knew that tree well. He had passed by it many times on his way home or during his tax rounds. But until that moment, he had never looked at it the way he was, looking now as an opportunity. An unexpected, almost absurd idea began to form in his mind. Climb that fig tree. Him, a man of position, a chief tax collector. Risk such exposure, literally place himself above the crowd like a child or a servant. But the desire to see Jesus was stronger than any embarrassment. "If no one is going to make way for me, then I'll make my own way," he murmured with a determination that even surprised himself. While the people remained focused on the road, waiting for the master's arrival, ZACCHAEUS began to move along the sides, slipping around the crowd with quick, discreet steps. Sweat dripped from his forehead. His heart pounded like he was about to commit a crime, but he couldn't turn back now. Every step brought him closer to the tree. Dust rose under his sandals. His feet stumbled over loose stones. But he didn't stop. Finally, upon reaching the base of the fig tree, he took a deep breath. He looked at the branches, evaluated the best foothold, and without hesitation began to climb. The first steps were firm. His hands gripped the branches tightly. With each meter conquered, a mixture of shame and courage filled him. He imagined the crowd laughing if they saw him like this. A man his age with his reputation hanging from a tree, like a desperate, curious child. But none of that mattered anymore. He needed to see Jesus, and the higher he climbed, the faster his heart raced. The city seemed to shrink below his feet, and with each branch, he reached a new perspective opened up from up there. He could finally have a clear view of the road, the crowd, and if God allowed, of Jesus himself. Reaching one of the strongest branches, ZACCHAEUS positioned himself so he could get a good view of the path where the master would pass. His chest heaved, his breathing was heavy, but his gaze was fixed. And at that moment, for the first time in many years, he didn't feel powerless. He had done something to break through the barriers that surrounded him. Something unexpected, something unthinkable for a man like him. Now all that remained was to wait. The crowd remained in an uproar. The shouts of expectation grew louder. People began to point towards the horizon. Jesus was coming. So he decided to do something unthinkable for a man like him. The sycamore fig tree swayed gently under the touch of the warm morning wind in Jericho. Its broad leaves offered shade to the few who dared stop there. But that day it had a very unusual occupant, ZACCHAEUS. There he was, hanging among the branches with his cloak wrinkled, his hands scratched, and his face sweaty. The dust from the climb still clung to his clothes. His knees trembled slightly, not just from physical exertion, but from the awareness that from his elevated position he was completely visible to everyone. From up there he saw the crowd like never before. A mass of anxious faces, raised arms, people squeezing into the smallest possible space along the road. The murmur grew by the second. Someone shouted Jesus' name, and the people responded in chorus like a sea of voices in unison. ZACCHAEUS, meanwhile, remained there standing among the branches trying to control his breathing. It was an almost comical scene, a man of his position known as one of the wealthiest and most feared figures in the city now hanging from a tree like a curious child. Something that in any other context would surely be a laughingstock. And perhaps it already was. While some eyes remained fixed on the road, others in the crowd began to notice his presence up in the tree. Small groups pointed discreetly. Some chuckled under their breath. Others simply shook their heads in disdain. Look over there. The great chief tax collector, hanging like a mischievous boy, mocked a young man, nudging his friend to look. Maybe he's scouting for a new spot to collect taxes. Another quipped provoking laughter around him, but ZACCHAEUS didn't care. Not at that moment. Something was stronger than the fear of being ridiculed. Something more urgent than the dread of losing what little dignity he had left. His focus was entirely on the road. With each passing second, the commotion intensified. Dust began to rise on the horizon, signaling that the procession was approaching. People along the street craned their necks, raised their arms, pushed against each. Zacchaeus fixed his eyes on that point, searching for any sign of unusual movement, any figure standing out in the midst of the crowd. And then, amid the confusion of voices and bodies, he saw him in the distance, walking with a serenity that contrasted with the surrounding uproar. And came Jesus. He wasn't the tallest in the group. He didn't have the pompous bearing of a ruler. But there was something about his presence, something that made everyone else around seem overshadowed. A silent magnetism, a kind of authority that needed no shouts or grand gestures to be perceived. Zacchaeus' eyes were locked on him. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might leap from his chest. His hands trembled on the branches of the fig tree. Sweat trickled down his forehead. It was as if at that instant time had slowed and everything else faded into insignificance. He observed Jesus' every step, every glance he cast toward the crowd, every smile, every wave. And as the Master drew closer, Zacchaeus felt that this was his only chance. Maybe Jesus would pass by without even noticing him. Maybe he would look only at those beside him, at the sick, at the poor, at everyone but him. Yet even so, he had to try. He had to see. He had to look at the man who, according to many, saw beyond appearances, beyond sins, beyond social masks. For a moment, Zacchaeus closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He felt the warmth of the sun on his face, the smell of the fig tree's leaves. He heard the sounds of the crowd now even louder. It was as if all his senses were heightened. From up high he became a spectator of his own story, an exposed man, vulnerable, who, without realizing it, was more visible than ever. The paradox was clear. For years, Zacchaeus had done everything not to be seen beyond his role as chief tax collector. He had hidden behind titles, expensive clothes, power, and invisible walls. But now there he was, hanging from a tree in full view of all Jericho. There was no hiding anymore. His decision to climb that branch was not just physical. It was symbolic, an act of exposure, of surrenders, of silent confession. Deep inside, he knew that day his life was about to change. Even without knowing how, even without understanding what would come next, something told him that this effort would not be in vain. He kept his eyes open, alert as if trying to capture every detail of that moment, the noise of the crowd, the familiar faces below, the dust in the air, the wind in the leaves and above. All the figure of Jesus drawing closer. Zacchaeus adjusted himself on the branch, seeking a firmer position. His heart beat so strongly it seemed to echo in his ears, and without him realizing at that exact moment, other eyes began to fix on him. Little did he know that he was not the only one watching. The sound of Jesus' footsteps on Jericho's dusty ground was almost inaudible amidst the murmur of the crowd. People around him stirred, called out, stretched out their hands, each carrying their own longing, healing, a word of hope, a touch, a miracle. Zacchaeus, clinging to the branches of the fig tree, watched with wide eyes. He could see Jesus more closely now. He noticed details he had only imagined before. The simple features of his face, the serenity in his expression, the firmness of each step. There was a quiet authority in that figure, a presence that made the turmoil of the crowd seem distant, secondary. Jesus advanced slowly, attentive to those around him. He paused to touch a child, smiled at an elderly man, exchanged words with a woman who offered him a jar of water. The Master walked with a gaze that seemed to pierce through bodies, seeing souls. Zacchaeus leaned in a little more, his eyes fixed. A mixture of anxiety and hope grew within him. His heart beat faster, as if each beat were a silent plea. See me. Just one look, just one look. And then it happened. When Jesus was right beneath the fig tree, in the middle of the confusion of voices, shveis, and expectations, he stopped. Simply stopped. It was as if time had frozen for a moment. Conversation ceased. The murmur quieted. A sudden silence fell over that part of the street, as if the very air had been suspended. Everyone nearby turned their eyes toward him, waiting for the reason behind such an unexpected pause. Some thought Jesus would speak to a child standing beside him. Others imagined he might perform a miracle right there, but no one, No one was prepared for what happened next. Jesus slowly and deliberately lifted his eyes. His gaze, which had been moving among the needy around him, now fixed on a single point, high up in the fig tree, and to everyone's astonishment. There, among the branches and leaves, was Zacchaeus. A brief murmur rose from the crowd. Heads turned upward. People pointed discreetly. Ironic smiles appeared on the faces of those who knew Zacchaeus' reputation. After all, what a scene that was. The most hated man in town, exposed, hanging, completely vulnerable, and now the direct focus of Jesus' gaze. But Christ's eyes showed no contempt, no irony, no condemnation. What Zacchaeus saw at that moment was something he would never forget. A gaze of infinite depth. A gaze that seemed to pierce through the hard shell he had built over the years. A gaze that saw beyond his social position, beyond his wealth, beyond his guilt. It was a gaze of recognition, as if Jesus had known him long before this moment. As if every unshed tear, every sleepless night, every stifled regret, everything was right there, laid bare before the eyes of God. Zacchaeus froze. He felt his entire body tremble. The branch beneath his feet seemed to waver for a split second. His hands clutched the fig tree's trunk even tighter. His blood pounded in his ears. He was there, seen, exposed without masks, without excuses. For a moment the whole world seemed to disappear. There was no crowd anymore. No more criticism, no more social status. Only that gaze that strangely and comfortingly said, "I see you." Zacchaeus didn't know what to expect. His mind raced in every direction. Would Jesus condemn him? Call out his sins in public? Make him an example of shame for all Jericho? Tension was palpable. The crowd held its breath. Some whispered among themselves, "Is he going to tell him to come down? He's definitely going to rebuke him. Maybe he'll expel him from here." But Jesus remained there looking at him with a calmness that seemed to carry centuries of mercy. There was no rush in his gaze, only truth. Zacchaeus felt his eyes fill with tears. Never in his entire life had anyone looked at him like that. Without hatred, without ulterior motives, without bargains. Just looking, seeing who he really was. His heart was about to explode. His throat tightened, barely letting him breathe. And then Jesus opened his mouth. The first words were about to be spoken, and what he did next changed everything. The silence still hovered over that part of the street in Jericho. Jesus, standing at the foot of the fig tree, kept his eyes fixed on Zacchaeus. Time seemed suspended, as if everyone there awaited the Master's next breath, the next word, the next gesture. Zacchaeus, clinging to the branch, had his heart racing. Sweat ran down his forehead, his hands trembled. Never in all his years had he felt anything like this. It was as if he stood naked before everyone, but at the same time embraced by that gaze that pierced right through him. And then Jesus' voice echoed, "ZACCHAEUS." The sound of his own name coming from Jesus' mouth hit him like an explosion in his mind, a shock, a calling that pierced through every layer of guilt and shame. For a brief second, Zacchaeus wondered, how does he know my name? He wasn't a man loved by the city. No one called him that with tenderness. His name was almost always spoken with accusation, with disgust, with cursing. Often people didn't even say his name. They preferred to refer to him as that tax collector or the traitor. But Jesus called him with disarming naturalness, like a friend calling another, like someone who had known him for a long time. Zacchaeus' eyes filled with tears instantly. The sound of his name, so familiar and yet so new, seemed to restore something deep inside him. But Jesus didn't stop there. His voice, clear, firm, and full of gentle authority, continued, "Come down quickly." The crowd around held their breath. Some opened their eyes wide in astonishment. Others furrowed their brows, trying to understand if they had heard it right. "Come down!" Quickly. Zacchaeus could barely process the words. His body reacted before his mind could comprehend. The impulse to obey was stronger than any shame or embarrassment. There was an urgency in that command that allowed no hesitation. But Jesus had more to say. For today, I must stay at your house. The impact of those words was like thunder breaking the silence. It was inconceivable. Mouths in the crowd opened in shock. Hands covered mouths. Disbelieving glances crossed from one person to another. Within seconds, the murmuring resumed. Now, in a scandalized tone, "What? At Zacchaeus' house? How could it be? He's going to stay in the house of a sinner?" The whispers quickly turned into audible murmurs. Indignation swept over the people like a rising wave. Faces that had been turned toward Jesus now turned toward each other, exchanging expressions of disbelief. It was as if the ground had opened up beneath Jericho. Zacchaeus, still up in the tree, could hardly believe what he was hearing. His legs trembled more than ever. Tears now streamed uncontrollably. His heart pounded wildly. His mind spun in circles. Jesus hadn't just called him, hadn't just seen him. He had chosen him, publicly declared his intention to stay in his house, the house of the man everyone despised, the house of the rejected sinner. Zacchaeus felt a flood of emotions, deep gratitude, disbelief, fear, joy all at once. And amid it all, one certainty grew inside him. Something supernatural was happening as he climbed down from the fig tree. The branches scratching his legs, his clothes becoming even more disheveled, he could think of nothing but those words. Today at your house, every step downward felt like a silent farewell to the life he had lived until that moment. The crowd, now in absolute shock, watched his every move with wide eyes. Some snorted in anger. Others shook their heads in disapproval. Others simply remained silent, confused and offended. How could the Master, the long-awaited Messiah, choose that man to enter his house? The scandal of grace was beginning to unfold, breaking every social and religious expectation of that people. The crowd twisted with indignation. The scandal of grace had begun. Zacchaeus could barely feel the branches beneath his feet. His descent from the fig tree was quick, almost clumsy, but he didn't care. His clothes, already dusty and wrinkled, now caught on the branches, leaving marks on his skin. Sweat streamed down his forehead, mixing with the tears that refused to stop falling. The invitation, or rather the command of Jesus, still echoed in his ears. "Come down quickly, for today I must stay at your house." It was as if those words had broken a dam inside him. All the shame, all the resistance, all the fear, everything was crushed by the force of that calling. There was no more room for hesitation. He came down without thinking, without measuring the consequences. Without considering what others were saying, his body reacted before his mind could even organize his thoughts. As his feet touched the ground, Zacchaeus felt his knees buckle slightly, as if the weight of years of guilt and isolation had finally manifested physically. But with an almost childlike effort, he stood up. He lifted his eyes and looked straight at Jesus for the first time in a long time. Perhaps for the first time in his entire adult life, he smiled genuinely, a broad smile, a mix of relief, surprise, and joy. The Master was there, close. So close that he could hear Jesus breathing, see the light in his eyes, feel the real presence of the one so many said was the Son of God. The crowd around watched everything with a mixture of shock and indignation. Whispers cut through the air like invisible blades. Unbelievable him of all people. The Messiah at the house of a thief. The faces of Jericho were loaded with disapproval. Some showed disgust, others disappointment, still others open outrage. It was as if in their eyes Jesus was making an unforgivable mistake. But none of that mattered to Zacchaeus at that moment. He didn't seek explanations. He didn't ask for guarantees. He didn't try to understand why Jesus had made such an unexpected gesture. His only response was obedience, with steps still shaky but determined. He approached Jesus, nearly tripping over his own cloak. His hands were still dirty with soil and covered with small scratches. But he didn't care. He looked at the Master with tear-filled eyes and a face lit with joy. Without saying a word, he made a welcoming gesture, as if opening the doors, not just of a house, but of an entire life. His joy was palpable, contagious, almost childlike. It felt like the reunion of a lost son with his father, like the sunrise after a long night of storm. In that instant, Zacchaeus didn't care about the whispers around him. He wasn't worried about what the religious leaders would think. He wasn't calculating the financial or social losses this decision might bring. His only focus was to bring Jesus to his home. As he walked alongside Jesus, a small procession began to form behind them. Part of the crowd followed, more out of curiosity and scandal than faith. Every step Zacchaeus took was accompanied by eyes that pierced him like invisible spears. Some indignant shook their heads in anger. Others, incredulous, simply watched in astonishment. But in Zacchaeus' heart, uncertainty grew. Something extraordinary was about to happen. There were so many emotions that he could barely organize his thoughts. Only one thing was clear. His house, once a symbol of ostentation and rejection, would now become the setting for a divine encounter. Upon reaching the door, Zacchaeus opened his arms, inviting Jesus in. Inside, the servants stood stunned. None of them understood what was happening. They had never seen their master like this, with a glow in his eyes, with a humble posture, with an air of peace they had never witnessed in him before. But as the scene unfolded inside, outside, the crowd kept stirring. The conversations grew in tone and volume. Indignation spread like fire on dry straw. "He's lodging in the house of a sinner," someone shouted. "Unacceptable," another replied. "And what about us, the righteous, the law-keepers, and he chooses the most unworthy?" The religious leaders from a distance watched with stern faces. It was as if Jesus' gesture was a direct affront to the established moral order, while the scandal of grace began to take shape outside. Inside Zacchaeus' house, a silent miracle began to sprout. The tax collector, until then a symbol of corruption, was now experiencing the first drops of a profound transformation. But the noise of the crowd threatened to grow even louder. The murmurs, once just whispers of scandal, began to take the form of open accusations. Voices united in a chorus of discontent. The commotion spread across all of Jericho. Zacchaeus could hear through the walls of his house the harsh words, the veiled insults, the indignant questions, and for a brief moment he wondered, will this joy I feel survive all this? Will what started here inside withstand the hatred out there? But the murmurs of the crowd threatened to silence his joy. The door of Zacchaeus' house closed softly, behind Jesus and the few who dared to follow him. Inside, the atmosphere seemed to shift in temperature, as if a soft and invisible breeze had filled the rooms. Zacchaeus stood still for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to comprehend what had just happened. His eyes wandered over the furniture, the tapestries, the luxury items that until that moment had seemed to represent his greatest achievement. But now in the presence of Jesus, everything seemed to lose its shine. The home of a rejected man built with the fruits of exploitation and injustice was now the stage for something holy. The servants watched in fear. Never in all their years of service had they seen their master act like this. ZACCHAEUS walked back and forth with almost childlike anxiety, quickly tidying up the living room, asking for fresh water, wiping dust off the table. It was as if for the first time the house truly needed to be ready to welcome someone who truly mattered. "Bring fruit. Bring the best wine, and bring fresh bread," he asked with an emotional voice, his hands trembling. Jesus observed everything with that same serene gaze. He sat down calmly, as if he had known that place for a long time, as if that moment had already been written in the invisible pages of eternity. Zacchaeus paused for a moment before him. He stood there almost unsure of what to say or do. His heart seemed ready to burst from his chest. His mind, once accustomed to calculations and profits, now searched for words that could express the whirlwind of emotions overwhelming him. It was strange to realize how that house, so often the setting for dishonest deals, was now becoming an improvised sanctuary, the space that had witnessed countless conversations about taxes, extortion, and illicit gains, now welcomed the presence of the Son of God. The walls that had heard the angry cries and despair of debtors now embraced words of grace and hope as Zacchaeus moved around, preparing everything with the little time he had. The exchanged glances among the servants revealed disbelief. "Him," murmured one of the oldest maids hiding behind the curtain, peeking out discreetly. Some of the tax collectors, friends and colleagues of Zacchaeus, had also been hastily informed. Curious, they approached cautiously, entering the house. The boldest leaned against the walls, watching from a distance. Others remained on the doorstep, afraid of being seen by the religious leaders who undoubtedly were still outside, indignant. The crowd, in fact, had not dispersed. Outside, voices kept growing louder. People who had once rushed to witness miracles now murmured among themselves. Some wept in frustration, others stomped their feet in outrage. It was as if Jesus' choice had been a direct insult to their understanding of justice. We the faithful left aside. He's lodging in the house of a sinner. Unacceptable. But inside the house there was a peace that contrasted sharply with the turmoil outside. Zacchaeus, his eyes still filled with tears, approached Jesus, carrying a jug of water to wash the master's hands. It wasn't a custom he had followed with devotion before, but at that moment it felt like the least he could do. As he offered the jug, his hands trembled so much that some water spilled onto the towel before Jesus even touched it. Jesus' gaze, however, remained kind. After washing his hands, Jesus accepted a piece of bread. That simple gesture had a profound impact on Zacchaeus. It was as if by eating there, Jesus was declaring, "This place now is a place where I feel at home." Every detail of that scene seemed loaded with meaning that transcended the ordinary. Words were few, but the look said much. Zacchaeus knelt there beside the table, not caring who saw him. His voice, choked with emotion, broke the silence. "Lord, thank you for coming, for looking at me, for calling me, for being here." Jesus only smiled, a small smile but full of grace. His presence filled the house like a gentle fragrance. The air felt lighter. Even the walls, once cold, seemed to warm with that visit. For a few moments, Zacchaeus forgot the furious faces outside, the judgments, the criticism. All that mattered was that presence, the certainty that God was there in flesh and bone, inside his house, inside his story. And even though few words were exchanged, an invisible transformation had already begun within that man's heart. Still, with every passing minute, the voices outside grew louder. The crowd stirred. The resistance to what was happening inside began to gain momentum. He should be with the righteous, not with sinners. This is an affront to the law, and the questions hanging in the air were many. How could Jesus choose someone like Zacchaeus? What is he trying to prove with this? How far does this grace he preaches really go? The scandal of grace which had begun on the road was now taking on new dimensions inside that house. And still many couldn't accept that scene. The sun over Jericho began to lean toward the west, casting long shadows across the alleys and the walls of the houses. But that afternoon, the greatest shadow hanging over the city did not come from the movement of the stars. It came from the heart of the crowd still gathered in front of Zacchaeus' house. The murmur grew more intense by the minute. People who had initially come out of curiosity were now caught in a rising wave of indignation. Voices once low now rose in open tones of reproach. He's in the house of a sinner. How is this possible? The Messiah, the one who claims to represent God, lodging with a thief. This is a scandal, an affront to the holiness of the law. Those who had always seen themselves as the defenders of justice and morality were visibly disturbed. The Pharisees with closed and rigid faces whispered among themselves, gesturing with irritation. Some religious leaders, their robes impeccably clean, exchanged condemning glances. It was as if the very heavens were being insulted. In the minds of many there, the mere fact that Jesus had crossed the threshold of that house was enough reason to doubt his authority. After all, what kind of prophet would associate with a man like Zacchaeus? Meanwhile, inside the house, the atmosphere was entirely different. Jesus remained serene, as if all the noise outside was just a distant echo. He spoke with Zacchaeus with a tone of disarming naturalness. There was no sermon, no accusation, just presence, listening, looking. Grace was there, breathable, almost tangible, but the clash between the outside world and what was happening inside that house was inevitable. Outside, the crowd demanded action. Many expected Jesus to come out, apologize, and say that it had all been a misunderstanding. Others waited for Zacchaeus to be publicly humiliated, for Jesus to confront him, perhaps even expel him from his own house in the name of divine justice. But none of that happened. The silence of waiting only fed the anger. Some men began throwing small stones at the house's facade, not hard enough to break anything, but as a symbolic form of protest. Women murmured among themselves, casting disapproving looks. The younger men shouted words of indignation, trying to draw Jesus' attention to what they saw as a gross mistake in conduct. He should be with us, the righteous, the law-abiding. Why him? Why the worst of all of us? The question echoed from different mouths, but deep down they all shared the same outrage. Jesus' grace felt unjust, scandalously unjust. For a people used to measuring spirituality by merit, good works, and outward appearance, Jesus' gesture was a direct affront to the established religious system, and ironically, that day Zacchaeus wasn't the main target of the harshest accusations. It was Christ himself. What had begun as murmuring now took the form of loud cries. He's staying at the house of a sinner. How can he claim to be sent by God? Jesus heard it all. He knew exactly what was going on in the hearts of those outside, but he remained where he was with unshakable peace. Inside the house, Zacchaeus, though aware of all the commotion, focused on only one thing: Jesus' presence. He felt a silent transformation happening within him. Something he couldn't name, but it was real, alive, pulsing. He heard the shouts through the walls and curiously, instead of feeling shame, what grew in his heart was an irresistible desire to change, not out of fear nor out of religious obligation, but out of gratitude. Jesus' words, few but filled with grace, were shaking the deepest structures of Zacchaeus' soul. He looked around his own house. Every object suddenly seemed to carry a moral weight. The silver goblets, the imported rugs, the locked chests filled with gold coins. Everything now felt small, irrelevant, almost offensive. Zacchaeus closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath. His heart burned. It was as if a flame had been lit inside him. And then he knew what he had to do. While the shouting outside grew louder, while the religious leaders fumed in their judgment, while his friends and fellow tax collectors watched in astonishment, Zacchaeus stood up. He walked to the center of the room, took one more deep breath, looked at Jesus, and with a firm voice, though slightly trembling with emotion, he spoke loudly enough for not only those inside to hear, but also for his words to cross the windows and reach the indignant ears outside. And while the people criticized, Zacchaeus was about to do something good, surprising. Zacchaeus took a deep breath. His heart was still pounding in his chest. Every fiber of his being seemed to vibrate between the tension of the shouts outside and the welcoming silence inside his own house. He knew that this moment carried eternal weight. He knew he couldn't remain silent. With visible effort, he stood up from where he was. His legs still trembled slightly, but his decision was firmer than ever before. He looked at Jesus, and the Master's encouraging gaze was all he needed to take the next step. Zacchaeus pulled a chair to the center of the room, climbed onto it, as if that small gesture was a symbol that he wanted to be heard, not only by those inside the house, but by all of Jericho. He took another deep breath and with a voice that mixed emotion and courage began to speak. Not with a defensive tone, not with rehearsed words. There were no justifications, no excuses, just a broken heart pouring itself out. Lord. His voice trembled as he spoke the word, a title that until that moment he had never dared to use sincerely. I have decided. There was a sudden silence both inside the house and in the surrounding streets, as if the walls had ears, as if the very wind had stopped just to hear what the chief tax collector had to say. I will give half of my possessions to the poor. The shock was immediate. Even the household servants who until then had been watching the scene as perplexed spectators widened their eyes. They looked at each other, incredulous. Half of his possessions. It was an absurd amount. Zacchaeus, the man known for his greed, was now spontaneously offering what most people could never dream of having. The coins accumulated over years, the properties, the lands, the luxury items, everything would be shared with those he had previously ignored. But Zacchaeus didn't stop there. With a now firmer voice as someone who knew exactly what he was doing, he continued, "And if I have extorted anything from anyone." He paused briefly, took a deep breath, looked at the faces inside the room, and as if looking at all of Jericho at the same time, declared, "I will repay 4 times as much." The impact was immediate. It was a scandalous declaration, but this time in the best sense of the word. Quadruple restitution wasn't something common. According to Jewish law, whoever stole had to return what was taken, and in some cases of proven fraud, repay 4 times as much as a sign of repentance and reparation. But here no one was demanding this from Zacchaeus. He wasn't being forced. There was no court, no judges. His conscience, touched by grace, was now his greatest judge and his greatest motivation. The entire house remained silent. The air felt heavier. The atmosphere was charged with an emotion difficult to describe. Outside, Zacchaeus' words began to echo among the crowd. People near the windows heard the declaration and started spreading it from mouth to mouth. Within minutes, the news spread through the streets like wildfire. He's going to give half of his wealth to the poor. Man, he'll repay 4 times over anyone he wronged. Faces of disbelief, which minutes earlier had expressed only anger and contempt, now began to show confusion. Some still maintained hardened expressions as if unwilling to believe it. Others frowned, trying to understand if this was real. The Pharisees, who until then seemed ready to pronounce harsher judgments, were left speechless. The crowd, once united in condemnation, now divided between those who kept their hearts hardened and those who secretly began to admire the courage of that man. Inside, Zacchaeus was still breathing heavily. He felt as if he had just lifted from himself a weight accumulated over years. It was as if with each word he was tearing down the bricks of a prison he himself had built over a lifetime. Jesus' gaze remained serene, but there was a different glow now, a silent approval, a joy that needed no words. For a moment, Zacchaeus lowered his head. He didn't know how Jesus would react. His decision was sincere, but he still carried fear, doubt, that old question echoing in his mind. Is this enough? Can God really accept me, even after everything I've done? Is there a place for me in the kingdom? He speaks so much about he expected judgment, perhaps a harsh sermon, maybe a list of spiritual requirements. But what Jesus would do next was something no one, not even Zacchaeus himself, could have predicted. But would this be enough in the eyes of God? The silence inside the house seemed to have become a character of its own. Zacchaeus' words still floated in the air, as if echoing off the stone and wooden walls. I will give half of my possessions to the poor and repay 4 times over anyone I have wronged. The room, which before had seemed wide and empty, was now thick with emotion, spiritual weight, and a dense atmosphere of transformation. The servants glanced at each other, still unsure how to react. Some covered their mouths with their hands. Others simply stood frozen as if witnessing a silent miracle unfolding right before their eyes. ZACCHAEUS remained standing, his face flushed with emotion, his eyes still brimming with tears. His chest rose and fell with rapid breaths. It felt as though with each second, the weight of years of guilt was being torn away layer by layer. But at the same time, a new responsibility was being born. The decision to make restitution wasn't just a verbal promise. It required action. It required sacrifice. It demanded revisiting the past, remembering each person he had wronged, every injustice committed, every pain caused. ZACCHAEUS already knew he would have to open the old records, recall forgotten names, and face again the faces he had so often seen merely as numbers in his tax ledgers. Every wrongly collected coin, every unjustly seized possession, all of it would have to be returned with grace interest. But for the first time, Zacchaeus didn't see this as a burden. He saw it as an opportunity for healing. While the crowd outside still murmured, Zacchaeus was already beginning to mentally make his list. He thought of old Simon, who had lost a piece of land after being unable to pay an unfair tax. He thought of the widow Rachel, who had had her few coins taken during a ruthless collection. He thought of the small merchants, the farmers, the families who had been forced to part with precious belongings because of him. Now everything would change. In that instant, Zacchaeus realized that true conversion wasn't just an internal change. It was a transformation that overflowed into concrete actions. Feeling guilt wasn't enough. It was necessary to repair. And by deciding to do so, something profound began to happen. The healing process, not only for him, but also for all those who directly or indirectly had been wounded by his choices. Zacchaeus had no idea how he would be received when knocking on the doors of those he owed. He didn't know if he would hear insults, if doors would be slammed in his face, or if he would be confronted with tears of despair. But none of that scared him anymore. His motivation was not to please others, nor to earn a new social status. It was something greater. The need to do what was right, to demonstrate with real actions that the man he used to be was now left behind. While reflecting on all this, Zacchaeus approached one of the tables in the room where he kept his account records. He ran his hand over the scrolls as if already anticipating the long hours of work ahead. For a brief moment, he smiled. A light, sincere, almost relieved smile outside. The rumors were already running through the streets. He's going to give everything back and double. No, 4 times over. Unbelievable. Is it really true? Some neighbors hearing the news came even closer to the house entrance, trying to confirm with their own ears. Others, more skeptical, crossed their arms and shook their heads. Let's see if he actually follows through. But inside the house, Zacchaeus no longer cared about public opinion. His decision was made. Meanwhile, Jesus remained seated, calm, watching every move. His gaze was one of deep approval, but also of expectation, as if he were waiting for the right moment to speak words that would be forever etched into that day. Jesus' eyes and Zacchaeus' eyes met. The chief tax collector, who until then had spoken to the crowd and to his servants, now turned exclusively toward the master. His eyes said everything his mouth couldn't express. Lord, I'm ready to change. But I need to hear from you. I need to know, am I forgiven? The silence inside the house grew even deeper. Jesus' words were about to be spoken. The moment that everyone there, inside and outside the house, had been waiting for was finally approaching. And then Jesus speaks, and everyone listens. The air inside the house was thick with expectation. Every eye was fixed on Jesus. Zacchaeus' transformation had been so sudden and so radical that even the servants, accustomed to their master's whims and harsh commands, now looked at him with a mixture of astonishment and respect. Outside, the crowd, who had moments ago expressed only contempt and disbelief, now instinctively awaited a response from Jesus. Everyone expected a verdict. Some hoped for a public rebuke. Others were just curious, but all wanted to hear what the master had to say about this unexpected spectacle of repentance. Jesus, for his part, remained silent for a brief moment. His gaze wandered around the room, then toward the open windows, where dozens of compressed faces strained to see what was happening inside. Then finally, with a calm voice yet full of authority, he spoke. Today salvation has come to this house. The words left his mouth like a thunderclap of grace. They weren't shouted. There were no exaggerated gestures, but the spiritual weight of that announcement made the ground seem to tremble beneath everyone's feet. Upon hearing it, Zacchaeus felt his knees weaken. The tears he had been holding back finally broke through every barrier in his eyes. He covered his face with his hands and wept like a child. It wasn't tears of sadness, but tears of relief, of liberation, of a weight being torn from his soul. Jesus not only acknowledged his decision, he publicly declared with full clarity that salvation had come to that house, to the house of a man previously condemned by all, to the house of a public sinner, to the house of the excluded, the rejected, the traitor. The crowd, hearing Jesus' words, reacted in various ways. Some, with still hardened hearts, shook their heads in disapproval. Salvation at Zacchaeus' house. How is that possible? Others, more sensitive, began to reflect in silence. It was impossible to deny that something supernatural was happening there. This wasn't just an emotional display. It wasn't some religious publicity stunt. There was a real, visible, tangible change. Jesus continued, because this man too is a son of Abraham. Once again, the crowd was caught by surprise. That statement carried enormous theological weight. In the eyes of society, Zacchaeus had long lost any right to be called a son of Abraham. His conduct, his profession, his choices had placed him outside the covenant community. To many, he was a Jew by blood but not by heart. But Jesus, with a simple and direct sentence, restored not only his social dignity, but his spiritual identity. He was telling everyone loud and clear, Zacchaeus belongs. He is part of the promise. He has a place among the people of God. It was more than an absolution. It was a reinstatement. It was as if with those words Jesus was building a bridge over the abyss that had separated Zacchaeus from his people, and more than that, from God. Zacchaeus remained on his knees, still crying, but now with a smile of relief, lighting up his face. The servants watched him with tearful eyes. Some tax collectors leaning against the walls began to reflect on their own lives. Outside, the murmuring began to fade, not because everyone accepted what they were hearing, but because faced with the authority of Jesus' words, it became impossible to keep shouting. And then, as if to make everything even clearer, Jesus declared in a firm tone, loud enough for everyone, both inside and outside the house, to hear, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." It was the final revelation, the true reason why Jesus had stopped along that road, the true reason why he had looked up at that fig tree. The reason why he had chosen Zacchaeus. Christ's mission from the beginning had always been this: to pursue the forgotten, the excluded, the marginalized, those whom everyone believed to be lost. Zacchaeus was just one more example, but an example now marked for eternity. Jesus' words echoed throughout the city like a manifesto of grace, like a public declaration that no one, absolutely no one, was beyond the reach of God's love. Zacchaeus, who for years had been seen as Jericho's greatest sinner, was now publicly announced as the direct target of salvation. The crowd remained silent. Some began to disperse. Others stood still as if trying to process what they had just witnessed. But inside that house once marked by corruption and greed, there was now life, hope, and salvation. And the true reason why Jesus had chosen him was finally revealed. The words of Jesus still echoed along the walls of the house and through the streets of Jericho like a solemn, irrefutable, and scandalously gracious declaration. This man too is a son of Abraham. For many in the crowd, those words felt like a stone hurled against the foundations of religious tradition. How could a man like Zacchaeus, a tax collector, an explorer, a traitor to his own people, be called that? Being a son of Abraham meant more than just a bloodline inheritance. It was a title of spiritual identity, of belonging to the people of the promise, to the covenant God had made with the patriarch of Israel. It was a seal of inclusion, a stamp of acceptance carrying centuries of meaning. And now Jesus, the Master, the Rabbi, the Messiah, was publicly saying that Zacchaeus was part of this sacred story. Inside the house, Zacchaeus remained on his knees. Tears still streamed down, but now there was a new light in his eyes. He understood the weight of those words. He knew this wasn't just a passing compliment. It was a restoration of identity, something he himself had believed was lost forever. For years he had lived as a foreigner within his own community, a man with no spiritual homeland, rejected in worship, ignored at festivals, excluded from community prayers. In the synagogues, his name had only been cited as an example of deviation and corruption. But now everything was changing by addressing him. Jesus was not only accepting him, he was reintegrating him outside. The crowd remained frozen for several minutes. The shock was evident. People exchanged glances, whispered, but no one dared to directly contest Christ's words. Some began to walk away slowly, shaking their heads like those carrying the frustration of seeing their traditional expectations of justice being broken. Others stayed, digesting each word, unsure of how to react. Among the Pharisees, the discomfort was palpable. This went against everything they had taught. The people in their eyes, Jesus was dangerously opening the doors of grace to someone who, by their standards, should have remained outside. But for Zacchaeus, every phrase from Jesus was like balm on old wounds, bringing his hands to his face. He lifted his eyes and once again met Jesus' gaze. There was no condemnation there, only acceptance, restoration, and a love that transcended understanding. Zacchaeus' heart beat with a mixture of relief and expectation. He felt clean, renewed, a new man. Slowly he stood up, taking a deep breath, still trembling, but now with an inner confidence he had never felt before. If before his house had been a place of profit and power, now it would become a home of generosity and service. If before his life had been driven by ambition, now it would be driven by gratitude. If before his name had been whispered in tones of contempt, now it would be remembered as a symbol of redemption. Jesus then began preparing to leave. The visit was coming to an end, but the impact of that moment would remain forever etched in everyone's memory. As he crossed the doorway of the house, Jesus cast one final glance at the crowd. And as if knowing that this episode would be told and retold for generations, he walked among the disbelieving faces, leaving behind a trail of reflective silence. Zacchaeus, standing at the door, followed the master with his eyes until he disappeared among Jericho's alleyways. One by one, people began to disperse, but Jesus' words continued to reverberate. Like a song that refuses to end, Zacchaeus took one last deep breath, looked up at the sunset-painted sky, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Belonging. Now he wasn't just a rich man. He wasn't just a repentant tax collector. He wasn't just a forgiven sinner. He was a son of Abraham. And as he watched the last rays of sun disappearing on the horizon, ZACCHAEUS understood that his story of rejection and fall had in truth been the perfect backdrop for the greatest revelation of his life. That God's grace knows no limits, and no fall is too deep for God's hand to reach. But this story was never just about Zacchaeus. The dust of Jericho has long settled. The voices of the crowd have faded with time. The stones beneath the fig tree, the branches marked by Zacchaeus' hurried steps, remain there as silent witnesses of that unforgettable day. But even as the centuries pass, the story remains alive because in truth, it was never just the story of a man of small physical stature and great spiritual guilt. It was and still is the story of each one of us today here. Now, as you listen to these words, it's impossible not to sense the echoes of that same call still hanging in the air. Perhaps you've never climbed a literal fig tree. But how many times in your life have you found yourself reaching for something, searching for an answer, for a look of acceptance, for a sign that redemption is still possible even for you? How many times have you felt too small, too unworthy, too rejected? How many times have you carried old guilt hiding behind social masks, professional status, or a rehearsed smile that conceals inner pain? Just like Zacchaeus, perhaps you've built walls around yourself. Walls of self-defense, walls of pride, walls made of justifications. But deep down, way deep down, there may still be a desire, a restlessness, a whisper from your soul saying, "Does he see me? Is there still hope for me?" The good news is, Jesus continues to do today exactly what he did that day in Jericho. He still looks up toward those who in one way or another are trying to catch a glimpse of him from afar. He still calls people by name. He still ignores the label society puts on us. He still pushes through the crowds. And he still says today, "I want to stay at your house." The question that remains for each of us is, what is our fig tree? What is the obstacle we must overcome? Pride? Shame? The fear of exposure? The doubt of whether we truly deserve that look of grace? Zacchaeus' story challenges us to make a choice. The first choice is the courage to expose ourselves to seek to climb our own personal fig tree, whatever it may be. The second is the willingness to come down quickly when we hear his voice. And the third, perhaps the hardest, is to surrender everything we are and have to be transformed. The call that echoed in Jericho still resonates. It crosses the centuries. It breaks through the silence of our sleepless nights. It penetrates the walls of our emotional and spiritual defenses. Jesus still calls, still looks, still recognizes, still transforms. And most extraordinary of all, he still calls by name today, now at this very moment. Maybe it's your name he's calling. The question is, are you willing to come down from your fig tree and welcome him into your house? May the story of Zacchaeus not remain just a distant memory, but become a personal invitation. Because the scandal of grace continues and it's reaching out to you. The end. If this story touched your heart, 2 more videos featuring other biblical characters who also experienced life-changing encounters with Jesus will now appear on your screen. Click to watch subscribe to the channel, and leave your like. And may God speak to you just as he spoke to Zacchaeus even when everything seemed lost.